Schizophrenics of Reddit. How did it start? Serious. Viewer discretion is advised. Please do like, share, and subscribe. The major symptoms didn't really manifest as something I noticed. I got mixed up in weird internet communities and ended up believing myself to be in a relationship with a fictional woman. It was so serious that I could actually hear her talking to me at times. But when I realized there was a problem, it started with little tiny things. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd see insects on the wall, or my phone's notification light flashing, or the shadow of someone standing behind me. At my office job, people liked to stand behind me and wait until I noticed them to actually talk to me. Then it grew. Occasionally, I'd see a shadow person walking under some street lamps, but they'd be gone when I looked again. Or I'd use my phone's GPS to go somewhere, and I could faintly hear it blabbering random syllables between instructions. What really frightened me was when I saw a little dancing dot in the center of my vision. It was the most direct, obvious sign my mind was failing. I went to the walk-in for an unrelated issue and brought up my hallucinations at the end of the trip, and the doctor told me that he'd get an ambulance for me if I didn't drive myself to the nearest emergency room. They put me in a little mental health assessment wing where I thought there were cameras in the walls. There was a really noisy fan in the bathroom that turned on with the lights, and I could swear I heard the nurse babbling to the security guard while I was in there. It didn't make any sense, just like the GPS, but it was about me. I knew I had to get out of there. Despite the delays from bigger hospitals, I was able to see a private psychiatrist who put me on medication. My issues stopped almost completely, with few side effects, once we found the right medication. I still see the occasional bug or something like that, but it's under much greater control now. People seemed like they were always looking at me and talking about me more than usual. I started getting worried the ground might vanish or my car windows were TV screens showing me fake sights. Saw little light pixie lights floating around by the time I got into the psych ward. When I was a very young child, I used to get visited by this light show that would come when I was scared and couldn't sleep. It was so pretty and looked like moving beads across the walls, almost like a kaleidoscope. Didn't connect it that was the beginning until years after my diagnosis. Before I was aware it was a thing, I woke up to lights being on that I swore I turned off. Hearing things in the house, I started to think my house was haunted, which was stupid considering I have a family history. My house was not haunted. My brain is. My first legitimate psychotic break, I was mountain climbing, saw a child on the summit and freaked out that he was going to fall. My friend just stared at me. There wasn't anyone there. I would hear a loud party in the kitchen as a kid when everyone was sleeping. It creeped me out at first, but eventually I could choose what music they played, and I stopped being scared. I had the feeling people were watching me, but would stop as soon as I started to watch them back. Then it began to feel like I was judged on everything I was doing, on how I was performing in life. At this time I was 13. It ramped up slowly until I reached 16. You know that feeling when you're talking to yourself, but you slowly realize it is not you that you can hear in your mind? I had that 3 days before Christmas when I got 16 years old, but I didn't want to tell my parents it's Christmas. Not exactly the best time to declare, yo, I am batshit crazy when you have family over. And let me tell you, my voice was super convincing to keep that for myself. Luckily for me, my aunt could not make it to my parents' house because she believed the FBI was looking for her. My uncle brought her to a psychiatrist who declared she had schizophrenia. Then it became clear to me that I was going through the same thing as her, so I told my parents. Then I got my diagnostic. That was the worst Christmas I've ever had. When I got married and suddenly moved across the country with my husband to college was my first psychotic break. 2 voices started talking to me regularly after that, and I realized that one of them had been there since high school. I just assumed everyone had an outsider voice talking to them too. I have a schizophrenia spectrum disorder called schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. It's like a combination of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It started for me when I was in middle school. I started feeling like I could feel other people's emotions and read their thoughts. Then I started feeling like they could read my thoughts. I began to hear music all the time at different volumes, sometimes quiet, sometimes deafeningly loud, coming from outside or the apartment next door. Throughout my life, I would have episodes where I would talk to or communicate with plants, or believe government organizations were out to get me. Sometimes I would have instances of disorganized speech or thought. A few years ago, it started to get worse. My hallucinations and delusions started to become more frequent and bizarre. At that time, I also started to have problems with negative symptoms. I stopped being able to concentrate on anything or motivate myself to do much of anything. I used to be a big reader, reading a dozen books a week, and now I can barely read 10 pages at a time. Hell, I can't choose between shows to watch on Netflix or channels to watch on YouTube. I just don't have it in me to care about it. But I'm still able to hold down a basic, which makes me a minority among people with schizophrenia. I microdosed LSD to cure long-term treatment-resistant depression and anxiety, supplementing every few months with MDMA. When I stopped this regimen, I began believing strange things and started hearing voices. I was a member of r/Zen at the time and put on quite a shit show with spiritual enlightenment as the primary object and interpretation of my illness. This lasted for some months, eventually culminating in hospitalization. Several years, thousands of dollars, and a lifetime later, I'm doing quite well. But for some time, I was completely disabled and had to build back from that. I noticed it in my early preteens, 12 to 14, and was dismissed by my family as being difficult, a liar, and never able to finish anything. By the time I hit my 20s, I was disassociating, narcissistic bitch who had no idea what reality was ever. I finally got actually diagnosed at age 25 and have had ups and downs for 25 years now. There wasn't necessarily a begin point, but I guess the first thoughts I started to have that were intrusive began when I was 14 or 15. I consistently thought the people around me wanted to kill me or harm me in some way. Didn't matter who it was. I started to believe that I could read people's minds and their intentions. I thought that my mother and father and everyone I thought was close would talk behind their backs and come to conclusions that I was someone they had to eliminate. It spun pretty deep from there. By the time I turned 20-ish, the thoughts became voices other than my own. I started to manifest outside influence within my mind. I believed that I could speak to God and he would speak back. We would have conversations. Lots of stuff just kept coming up. I didn't tell anyone and made it worse when I did. I told my mother about this when I was about 22, and for a year or so, she constantly would make comments that she was afraid I would murder her and told multiple people about my condition without my permission, and would say things like she needs to lock her door at night now, and she can't leave her room at night because she thinks I'll come murder her. Do you mean why? In my case, it was genetic. My grandfather, uncle, aunt, and 3 cousins also have schizophrenia. It didn't start suddenly. My first total psychotic break wasn't until a few years after I started hearing voices. The first hallucination I had was of a snake, and it was because I knew it wasn't real that it was frightening. I kept insight whilst the experiences grew for a few years until I lost it and derailed into total delusion. My delusions, when they occur these days, mainly consist of the idea that something, a mechanical ball, a giant grub, a controlling diode, has been inserted into me somehow, and I have to remove it, or I or others will die or be harmed as a result. Main reason why I don't have an IUD or similar for birth control, it would certainly trigger my illness enough to rip it out. I started hearing people talking about me constantly, and people calling or whispering my name. As a kid, I was always afraid of people watching me, and although I realized that can't be true now, I still have the same problem. I also began to see bugs where there weren't any, and a masked man sometimes. This may have began when I saw a Slender Man documentary when I was a young kid that scared the shit out of me. Best friend of mine is schizophrenic. Now his father is also schizophrenic, and at the time we didn't know it could be passed down genetically. We were 15 at the time, and we had a few friends over because we planned on tripping on mushrooms and salvia. Well, like the dipshit kids we were, we just assumed we would see cool colors and go to space, lol. And for context, we were experimenting with drugs a lot at that time. That is not what happened. We took 2.5 grams of mushrooms and smoked about 3 bowls of salvia. Needless to say, he was destined for greatness. All jokes aside though, that's when his started to develop. He started to believe there were ghosts in his house. that he was haunted and have extremely intrusive thoughts at school. From what he told me, the voices would tell him to burn down the school and light it on fire. So he decided to tell the counselor that he was having these thoughts, but he didn't want to follow through with any of it. Well, the school counselor called a crisis counselor, and the crisis counselor called the cops on him. He was looking at 5 years with intent to homicide. It was extremely sad that it happened that way because he was just trying to get some help, and he was still so young, like only 16 when things really started to ramp up. But some good news, he was released from juvie within a week and a half, had an amazing counselor who helped him out with all of it, and he's doing substantially better. Good. I'm a paranoid schizophrenic who has a bunch of fun symptoms that are a bit lengthy to get into, but the most random or interesting ones is that I have visual hallucinations of bears in my home. Now, it's more like a, oh, what? Why is there a bear in my room? Guess I'll close the door so it can't get out and sleep on the couch instead sort of deal. I used to freak out, lock myself in the bathroom crying my eyes out and call people that there's a bear in my house. But I just try to remind myself now when I see one that I live on the 14th story of an inner city apartment building in New Zealand. Why would there be a bear in my apartment? It started in high school for me. I suffered from childhood trauma and a suicide attempt before all this, so those may have been factors that caused it. At first it was voices. I thought I could hear spirits and talk to them. Then I started seeing them. Sometimes they were like people, other times they were more like demons. They would often harass me and frighten me in public places, try to get me to react. For some reason I believed that this all had to be kept a secret, so I tried my best not to acknowledge them when I was around other people. There were also other things like strings coming out of people's skin. I also started believing that my dreams were prophetic and the end of the world was coming. Eventually my parents caught on that something was wrong with me, and they took me to see a psychiatrist. That was when I was 18. To this day, I still have a phobia of mirrors thanks to one hallucination I had. What was it? I started meeting these huge wolves in a forest near where I lived. The rest of the world disappeared and I could morph into a wolf myself and just run around as if running away from danger and towards a new hunt. In real life, I was just a girl who took off her shoes and socks, no matter what the weather was like, running around the forest. When I was particularly stressed out, I would sneak out in the middle of the night to run with the wolves, feelings of being followed, watched, and general paranoia. I used to do everything as if I was being recorded, screaming in my head in an attempt to fade out my own thoughts that I felt was not controlled by me, seeing shadow people, generally a vivid imagination and a lot of daydreaming to escape reality as a scared child. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia at 19 after several years in and out of mental institutions. By now that I am almost 24, I believe that I don't have schizophrenia, even though mental illness including schizophrenia runs in my family. Another psychologist I had for several years believed I have CPTSD and DID, which I personally relate better with, but since I got the diagnosis, I thought I'd share my beginning of psychotic behavior. I had it in my family, but lived an active life and didn't think I was predisposed until after smoking weed every day for 2 years or so. One day I woke up and my perception of myself had changed. I won't go into details as of how, but I continued to use drugs and went on to harder ones, and during the 18 years I used meth, I could relate to almost every mental illness I heard described. The doctors gave me the diagnosis schizophrenia, but I'm completely rehabilitated now, and with medication I live a good life, better than I thought were possible. At 12, after long periods of intense mental distress, it started off with me getting really paranoid of other people. Then I started hearing a single voice. It was comforting at first. It didn't talk a lot, but it was like having a friend I could vent to and who would validate my feelings. But then it turned against me. It ended up with me thinking I'm possessed by a demon sent from hell to punish me for supposedly killing my twin sister while we were in the womb, which has never happened. My mom was never expecting twins. That whole period of my life is so blurry, and when I read my diaries I wrote at that time, it's more like I'm reading something a completely different person wrote. It almost feels intrusive. I believe my father is a paranoid schizophrenic. Sorry if that's not PC, this is new for me. He has not been diagnosed officially, though my mom's therapist diagnosed him after meeting him just 3 times. I'm sure it was always there, But according to my mother, symptoms started showing up after he had surgery on his feet for severe arthritis. I was too young or naive to notice, so again, according to my mother, he would accuse her of cheating on him. Along with that, she said he would accuse her of drugging me to bring men into the house, having people follow and watch him, having people bug their house, bug his phone, etc. I was around 12, 2010-ish, when they got divorced. They were both telling me horrible things about each other, and I didn't know what or who to believe, so I just kind of chose not to believe any of it. Fast forward to today. My dad and stepmom, who I love dearly, she helped raise me, are getting a divorce. My dad says it's because she is toxic. Now, she's not perfect by any means, and I know I didn't know 100% of their relationship, but she took care of him, literally. He has diabetes and heart issues, but, according to my stepmom, he has been accusing her of bringing her new friends out on their property to put up cameras and microphones, basically the same stuff he accused my mom of doing. She only has like 2 good friends and has known them for 10 plus years. My stepmom did not know that my mother went through the same thing until I told her 2 weeks ago after I found out all this. As far as she knew, my mother had an affair and that's why they divorced. Looking back over the years, I can remember seeing the signs, but I guess I just didn't want it to be true. I was always riddled with problems from an early age. Narcissistic, hypomania, depression. At the age of 25, I guess, after flattening a company I built up and a 4-year-long relationship with a wonderful woman in one swift strike, I came back to my home country and started doing drugs. I consumed some LSA and cannabis before, but then started to take MDMA, LSD, DOI, shrooms, and went dancing like 3 times a week. At first, it was all honeymoon, but after a year or so, the trip went ongoing. My first thought was, nice, free trip, but it spiraled down pretty harshly over time. I nailed carpets over my windows and put forest sounds on speaker of my cell phone when shopping late at night, which was the only time I left my house. At first, the voices were kind of friendly, but it spiraled downwards. My friends separated themselves from me, but I don't really blame them. I spoke very seldom and wasn't in a good mood anymore. There were drug addicts who wanted a good time, which I couldn't deliver anymore. In the end, I think I handled it quite well because I had a lot of experience with psychedelics and knew how to handle myself in every situation. I knew I was sick and therefore could interpret situations always with a grain of salt, like taking nothing too serious because there was a saying in my peer group at the time, "Du darfst nu nie vergessen, dass du LSD genommen hast." You mustn't forget that you tool LSD. Anyway, long story short, after a particular eye-opening shroom horror trip, my mother mentioned that it's maybe time to go into a hospital. I thought about that for a week and came to the conclusion that she was right and turned my life around. Sometimes a simple question is enough to change a lifelong path, but I was at rock bottom, and that may have helped too. The worst thing that even a year after starting medication and hallucinations become very rare to non-existent. I still would doubt reality if something strange happened and always had to check with people around me if that really happened. TL, DR, started with drugs. After some trip didn't stop anymore, thought, yay, free trip. Had verses, a whole story in my head. Most of the time, they were 3 of them, sometimes 2. When the third then arrived later on, the 2 voices would fill in the third on what he or she missed.